also work really closely with our area agency on aging, which also serves every area of the state. And so thinking about where the federal Older Americans Act funding is going and how to advocate for some transportation and mobility needs there as well. And then also in our community, we have Centers for Independent Living, or CILs. And so we've got a few in the Columbus region, and they're also doing really great work in terms of transportation and mobility. And then finally, of course, our Regional Planning Commission, which is MORPC, as well as our local transit authority, CODA, really doing great work around listening and bringing advocates together to make sure that as our region improves, that the aging and disability lens are added in that work. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Edward.
Okay. Right. Well, in terms of like the age in place, we're actually currently working on some programs for that are funded with a community development block grant for the city, like I mean more like for like mobility, for like like handrails and grab bars, and we also have a program in place for wheelchair ramps. But in terms of the programs for like people with like the elderly and the disabled, we do have we are part of one of the communities that are served by the Greater Cleveland Regional Transit Authority, or RTA. And even though they do provide adequate services for the disabled and the elderly, one of the concerns that we have is because of the funding that that public transit receives throughout the state of Ohio, that there needs to be a larger push toward seniors and disabled persons who utilize public transit or want to utilize public transit but can't because of where routes go, as well as the frequency of bus service and so on.
Great. And Vera?
Thank you. In Northwest Ohio, there are a lot of different groups sort of collaborating. But for the Ability Center specifically, I can speak to, we have put a lot of effort within the last calendar year. We passed issue 12 in Lucas County, which helped move the transit funding model from housing property tax to a sales tax, which finally put us on an equal playing field as the rest of Ohio. We're the last to catch up to the rest of Ohio when it comes to our transit authority. So that was an exciting step, and now we're looking into what that expansion actually looks like for Lucas County. And that's been an interesting conversation as well here with our transit authority. Our focus, of course, is ensuring that this expansion is equally accessible, if not more accessible than what we have now. And there are some conversations that we think could possibly take a step back in that accessibility. And so that's where we are coming in with our advocacy when it comes with transportation. We're also looking, of course, at what Amtrak could look like and passenger rail could look like in Northwest Ohio. Toledo is kind of like that stepchild, right? There's the big C's, there's Cincinnati, there's Cleveland, there's Columbus. And then there's Toledo. It's like, are we Michigan? Are we Toledo, Michigan? Are we Toledo, Indiana? Like, who knows, right? But we also want to be connected, especially when it comes to advocacy. A lot of the work I do is systems advocacy. So that means that I also want to meet with my legislators. And the drive to Columbus is surprisingly broken up. Even if you look at the highways, right? That's not thinking about, just public transit, but also just driving myself there is surprisingly just tedious. Whereas it's actually easier for me to drive to Cleveland, and drive from Cleveland to Columbus is a much smoother ride. But of course, that adds 3 hours to my drive. So we're looking at what that means in terms of access. We want to make sure that everyone from Ohio has access to what's happening at the State House, and also just what's happening in our communities here in Northwest Ohio when it comes to the bus system. I was going to add something there. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. But we're really excited mostly on that expansion. Passing issue 12 was a big deal. We had tried before for about 10 years. People in Lucas County have been trying. And so when it finally passed last year, it was a really big celebration.
Awesome. Thanks, Vera. I can speak from Cincinnati, a community who tried to pass a bus levy for like 40 years unsuccessfully. That finally did a couple years ago. So I'm excited for you guys, and you're in for a much better future, I'm sure. So accessibility work going on here in Ohio is fire. That's right, Angie. Accessibility work going on here in Cincinnati. So along with the metro expansion, we are sort of on a 5-year plan called Reinventing Metro. And one of the most exciting aspects of that is the levy money is also being used to repair infrastructure in the community along with the bus system. So infrastructure is being used all throughout the county, and each individual community is asking for money from the levy that's being used for simple things that people with accessibility needs are benefiting from. So issues like sidewalks near bus stops is a big one. More accessible actual stops that have covers on them. And Metro is also working to make their signs more legible, more clear for individuals. They are discussing the possibility of incorporating Braille in some way, and organizations that they are partnering with include Silo, which is our own community SIL, which I'm on the board of. So that's exciting. And they're partnering with CABV, excuse me, which is the organization for blind and visually impaired, as well as many others. And one thing I didn't share in my introduction is, as a pedestrian, I've also been hit by a car 3 times. This was going, over the span of 10 months, I was hit by a car while in a crosswalk or on a sidewalk. And I think Angie actually wrote about that for me at one point. But so one thing the city of Cincinnati is doing in kind of the downtown area is they are working toward a Vision Zero model, where they are doing things like making sidewalks, crosswalks raised. They're making them more visible for individuals. And while that helps, of course, the broader population, I can speak from experience as a wheelchair user, that has vast benefits for the disabled community as well. As in my chair, I stand about as tall as a 7-year-old. So that would benefit me immensely. And I look forward to the city of Cincinnati expanding that Vision Zero program. And finally, here in Deer Park, we're a community in the suburb of Cincinnati of about 5,500 people. We are slowly but surely, I'm working with my city council to focus on repairing sidewalks and making our community more walkable. That's one of the great benefits for where we are kind of situated in the suburbs. We're a very walkable community. So repairing sidewalks and making crosswalks more visible for folks like myself and for children. So I'm going to pass it on to the next question here. I'm going to go to Vera. What would you say in your area is the greatest need for accessible, for the accessibility community?
Yeah, so luckily in our area, the city of Toledo is adapting something called ProWAG. I can't remember exactly what the acronym stands for, but essentially it's a best practice in accessibility when it comes to streets. so that we don't have situations, Neil, like yours. I am so sorry that has happened. But we have also had similar situations here in Lucas County. And I also think there's a heavy focus on the city of Toledo, but Lucas County is more than just the city of Toledo, right? We have the suburbs, we have the townships that are around. And then of course, Northwest Ohio can become pretty rural as you leave the Toledo area. So there's a lot of there's no connection out there. And there needs to be, right? Like we need to make sure that everybody can get around to the spaces that they need to get to. So that's a huge step. And like I said, with our transit authority, TARDA is what ours is called, Toledo area. Currently, they're looking at 2 scenarios to expand. Scenario A kind of centralizes, again, in the city of Toledo. But what that means is that for paratransit, which is only required by the Americans with Disability Act to go out to that 3/4 of a mile of fixed line, it actually would kind of shrink how far paratransit can go, which would actually be a loss for the disability community, which, you know, fought so hard to get this, you know, passed in Lucas County. So that's definitely a huge focus of ours right now. And then scenario B would geographically expand. But of course, everyone's saying like, oh, there would be longer wait times. But I can tell you that right now, people are waiting about 90 minutes for a bus. So our system has been outdated for a long time. It was sort of created, and then as people came in and out, you know, they kind of added one here, added another road there, and it's like, oh, okay, that seems fine. So everything is a little bit all over the place, for lack of a better term. So right now, looking at our transit authority and ensuring that they stick to their promises and ensuring that everything is made accessible, you know, and including things like signs. I have been helping them review their new signage, making sure that it's, again, ADA accessible at minimum. You know, and they're hoping to update all of those throughout Lucas County as well. So that is one of our major priorities. And of course, we've been talking a lot about what it could look like to have that rail system up to Michigan and also to Columbus. And I would absolutely love that. I could actually visit my friends. I could meet someone for lunch on a weekend and come back. You know, how exciting would that be? It would expand access to, it would just expand our quality of life, I think, in Ohio. So that's what we have been focusing on a lot here in Northwest Ohio.
Great, thank you. Katie.
Yes, let's get that rail in there, Vera. I'll meet you for lunch somewhere. I would love that. So a couple of things I want to mention that are going on that I don't have a major role in, but that these projects are including the aging and accessibility lens and some inclusive planning efforts. So I think that's really important for me to mention. So Columbus also has a Vision Zero plan, which I put in the chat box. I'm going to put a bunch of stuff in the chat box throughout this conversation. There's this big project going on called Link Us, which is looking at connecting different corridors across Franklin County in Central Ohio. CODA, our transit authority, launched through their paratransit agency, Mainstream On Demand, which is, you know, kind of like a Lyft Uber situation, but with the paratransit, and that's been hugely successful. And then really it's a lot around sidewalks and connectivity as we continue to push forward, thinking about how to support alternative modes of transportation for everyone, right, outside the vehicle. What are our sidewalks? What's the connectivity, our curb cuts, crosswalks, looking at multi-use paths. So there's really a lot of separate projects going on, but the good news is there's a lot of overlap in the leaders working on that. And I'm really happy to say that most, if not all of those projects have had a seat at the table on the committees for the aging and accessibility lens as well. I'm going to put a couple more plans in the chat box in case anyone wants to see them as they relate to some of the work going on and committee work that they've had aging and accessibility onto. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. Edward?
All right, thank you very much. So first off, Neil, I'm really sorry about that, about the that accident that occurred. As a matter of fact, if this does come up later, that is one of the things that even concerns me as somebody on the autism spectrum who sometimes the stimuli of speeding vehicles can have an impact on people who have an impact on the way they get around and even driving and riding their bicycle. And while it may, while speeding drivers may be an annoyance to most drivers, it's especially harder for people with autism. But anyway, so going back, so before I divert further, I'm going to go back to like what we've got going on in like the greater Cleveland area. I know that the city of Cleveland just recently introduced a complete and green streets ordinance that their city council is going to be reviewing and then considering, and we're hoping that it passes, but it's more for the city of Cleveland. But it will also focus but what's also going on is the East Side Greenways trails where trail networks throughout the eastern portion of Cuyahoga County, which is the county that Cleveland is in, connecting those linkages throughout the eastern suburbs of Cuyahoga County, which Euclid is one of them, as well as just continued support through the Regional Transit Authority for greater accessibility towards their existing paratransit system and their bus routes. And also, at the local level, we have installed new crosswalks with with the covers on it, to assist pedestrians with disabilities as well, and as well as seniors.
Great, thank you. So I would say the greatest need in our area, at least that I have experienced, is so previous to this levy passing, we have what's called Access, which is our paratransit for people with disabilities. And before the levy, they were, to be frank, a total mess. They were outsourced to another company that was running it, and they did not have a great record. So they are now under the umbrella of Metro, and as Metro has expanded the geographic space that they are servicing, that has, as Vera mentioned, in Toledo, is having the benefit of reaching wider for people with disabilities, right? But they still have a lot of issues as far as timing, as far as showing up on time for individuals. If I don't personally use Access, but if I were to, and I wanted to use it to meet my friend for lunch, I would have to end that lunch by a specific amount of time and be out the door and on that bus, or else it's going to leave me. And so we need to figure out different models, either through Access or through other avenues that we have now with public transportation, to service that community in a way that's more inclusive and allows us to have more freedom. That's what I would say is our greatest need, at least that I've experienced. So what types of mistakes, guys, do you think, what types of mistakes do you think planners make around accessibility? I think I'm going to start with Katie this time.
I was really hoping you weren't going to start with me on that one. So one thing I've learned is, in terms of like a mistake, if you will, is generally speaking, it's not malice, right? It's ignorance, or just not knowing specific resources are out there. I know a lot of planners, I work with a lot of planners, and everybody that I've ever worked with is really working to get things right. So I just have to start off by saying that. So I think this idea around making sure that individuals with differing abilities, mobility abilities, are at the table is an area where sometimes folks can miss the mark. So when you think about inclusive planning efforts, when you are inviting people to review a plan or to participate in an event, a lot goes into that to really making someone feel welcome, like you really want them there, right? Is the space that you're hosting the event in accessible? Is it on a bus line that has a bus stop that's connected to the sidewalk that leads to the building? Are you offering things like translation of materials or sign language interpretation? Is the font of your information at least 12.14 at most, right? So really thinking through some of those efforts that truly make people feel like you want them there, like you want their feedback. And then on the other side of that, really listening to what people say and incorporating that to make sure that you, when someone gives input, that you actually see the change and that your plans reflect true listening sessions. So I think that's it, unless someone else, when they weigh in, sparks something else up, but that would be it for me.
All right, Edward.
So, I hate to ask this, but what was the question again?
Yeah, so what, generally, what types of mistakes do you think planners make around accessibility?
Oh, right. So, I feel that, oftentimes, like when it comes to like transportation planning, it's just the auto-centric nature of planning that seems to that seems to overshadow a lot. And I know that, and I think it's a lot of it's from like the like pressure from traffic engineers that may are so car centric that they completely that they seem to treat pedestrians and cyclists secondarily. Like I understand that they have well intentions, but at the same time the way drive we have to respond in the way drivers drive, because there's been a concern for unsafe driving, especially as we're coming out of this pandemic, when where there's more distractions behind the wheel, as well as distractions behind the wheel, as well as there's a very limited speed and traffic enforcement. And also, like when planners go to design roadways to try to slow cars down, there's often opposition to that. And also from an autistic lens, there are people with autism who do drive. There are people with autism who don't drive, and those who do drive, no autistic driver is the same. I mean, though there are those who follow the law to the letter. I mean, oftentimes, like even going as far as setting their cruise control at the posted speed limit, and also then there are those who can't drive, but also have jobs, but can't get to it because of public transit disparities. And I hope that answers the question. And if there's any follow-up question, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Vera?
Yeah, so I am inclined to echo both Katie and Edward here. I think a lot of what happens is simply ignorance. And again, as Edward said, the autocentric mentality. So in Northwest Ohio, in Toledo, even when we were pushing to pass, the levy for TARDA, we had a lot of comments, mostly on social media. We always say, don't read the comments on social media, don't read the comments under a news article, but we all do, of course. And the comments, were just, well, why don't you just get a car? Why don't you just, it's a very car dependent culture. Also, we're right by Detroit, which is the birthplace of cars, right? Woodward, it was the first paved road ever in the United States, I believe. You might have to double check me, don't quote me. But Ford is right there. Our economy for a long time was just auto and car workers until they dipped out and went over to overseas. So there's just a heavy love for cars in Northwest Ohio. We still have Jeep Fest, and it's like a big deal. People come from out of town, and people are so proud to serve on the committee for Jeep Fest. And you know what? If you love your Jeep, that's fine. That's fine. You could name it, you could call it her, whatever, that's fine. But we need to make sure that you're sharing the roads and you're sharing the space that we have, right? Like, if you were to take out all the paved roads and leave them as an empty space, and you only had the sidewalks to get from place to place, would you be able to actually get anywhere, or would you fall through that hole? You would fall through a lot of holes throughout all of Lucas County in Northwest Ohio. There's only just, again, car dependent. There's also situations, for example, studies have shown that when we have trees in our neighborhoods, they naturally slow down drivers. Why aren't we doing more of that? We know that it's accessible, it is cheaper than setting up police cameras everywhere, but we don't do that. And it's like, why haven't we focused on that? And it's because there is a lobby to keep places car dependent. There are people that are making a lot of money, so there is that. And I think also people sometimes focus on what we call like greenwashing, right? So it's a lot fancier to drive a Tesla than it is to get on the bus. It's a lot fancier to put in some electric charging stations for a car, which aren't always accessible, by the way, than it is to pay your $1.25 for whatever it may look like. Right now we're fare free because of the pandemic, but whatever that pricing might be, and get on the bus and share it with other people, because then you actually have to look at your community in the eyes. You don't get to be in your exclusive little bubble, right, with your expensive car. So I'm just really challenging people here to also think about, what does being green mean? And who's making money off of trying to sell you these green things, right? So there is a lot of that. And I think there's also generally this idea that people with disabilities create a smaller amount of the population. Sure, 25% of the population in the United States are people with disabilities. Yeah, okay, that's 1/4, but that's 1/4. Like, when you think of it in terms of numbers, it's a very large number. When you're thinking of it in terms of percentage, sure, 1/4, but even if that was a pie, right? 1/4 of a pie is still a really big chunk. Like, that would still make me feel a little sick if I ate 1/4 of that, unless I purposely prepared for it because I'm at Thanksgiving and I really want that sweet potato pie, So I think there's that aspect too, where it's like, oh, there's less of them, so we don't have to focus as much. And that's not true. When we create things to be universally accessible, they help everybody. Not only, for example, wheelchair users might benefit, right? But we have moms with strollers, just parents with strollers, I'm sorry. We have people with shopping carts, right? Like, I have one of those little carts that I love to drag around from the farmer's market, but can I actually get that all the way home? Or do I have to put it in my trunk and then drive home? So we really benefit everybody when we say universal access. And I think people think that we're asking for a special sort of treatment, but that's not true. We're just leveling out the playing field, finally. The ADA is only 30 years old. It passed in 1990, so 31. Like, if it were a human, it's still really young. It's still figuring out its life, right? Like, we really need to figure out why we treat it like, oh, everything's fixed now. Like, ADA is the floor and we deserve way more.
So I was born the same year as the ADA, so I can confirm I'm still trying to figure out my life. As is the ADA. So I would say the greatest mistake planners make is sort of a mistake the general population makes. So I would want individuals to reframe how they view folks with disabilities. It's not just people who have visible disabilities like myself. everybody knows I have a disability, but disabilities include folks like Katie works with that are elderly. It includes folks like Edward. It includes individuals that don't have visible disabilities, right? But it also includes, or I'm sorry, I would also want to have people reframe how people with disabilities live their lives. You know, folks don't just need transportation to go from a home to a hospital back to a home, or just to go from a job to a hospital to a home and back. We live full lives. We want to go everywhere everybody else can go. And we want to experience life the same way everybody else can, with just a little bit of assistance. So making sure those assisted tools are in the places everybody goes, not just the obvious places, I would say, are the things that I would want planners to correct, reframe their mindset, I should say. But I'm going to change the subject a little bit. So I'm going to include a couple questions here and kind of combine them for time here. So what do you feel are the transportation disparities and safety concerns that folks with autism face in accessibility? So I think I'm going to go with Edward for that one.
And thank you so much, Neil. So about safety concerns is, the risk, mostly the stimuli and the way people with autism react to their environment. Going back to a comment that I made earlier about, like, for example, a person who has autism who drives or rides their bike, and and they're often, and the way oftentimes, they were taught, because they're black and white thinking, they were taught to follow the rules of the road, obey the speed limit, stop at the stop sign, stop at the red lights, use your turn signal, and yield to pedestrians, yield to cyclists. And they oftentimes follow those rules to a T. I'm sure, certainly not all autistic drivers are like that, but most are, including me. And oftentimes, there's also that stimuli of other drivers who are driving way faster than them, who are not obeying the rules of the road like people with autism are, and also, just creates that stimuli there, and they're even at a greater disadvantage when when a person who drives more recklessly oftentimes drives behaves around the person who's trying to be more obedient. And also there's the concern of just general safety of the roadway, especially or I'll even say, as an example of a bicyclist who may be on the autism spectrum, who is riding in the bike lane, or bikes on the road, to either to commute or just to go for a bike ride, and they're often having to deal with with reckless drivers who either A, not paying attention to them, or B, the very few who actually are trying to attack cyclists. And of course, it's worse for non-autistic cyclists, but it's just as bad for non-autistic cyclists, but it just hurts a person with autism just that much more. And then now going to the transportation disparities, I wanted to add about how there are people, there is a very high unemployment rate among people with autism, but those who are employed may have trouble getting the jobs because their autism is severe enough to where they can't drive. So they do need public transportation, and frequent public transportation, so they can be able to live their lives, such as going to work, shopping, and just going places, and just providing just a better transportation and safer roads for everybody. Of course, as Vera said earlier, there's that notion that people with disabilities make up a lesser percentage of the population. And I do remember years back there was a a pilot project that we did in Euclid, where we did put in a temporary bike lane and a temporary crosswalk in a busy commercial district. And I remember a resident arguing, saying that using a quote, saying that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, which is majorly incorrect, because because the few are still people just like you and I.
Wow, I did a literal facepalm on that. That's unfortunate that that person thought that way. I'm so sorry, I'm on mute the whole time. I did a literal facepalm that time. That's really disappointing that people thought that way. Vera, did you have something to add?
Yeah, so here, Edward, it made me think of you saying, the needs of the few outweigh the needs of the many. We had somebody from our transit authority who's supposed to be in the mobility leadership team say we need to make this work for everyone, not just a few. When we were talking about our fears of paratransit being, shrinking. So this is a mobility, professional. So that's what we're up against in Northwest Ohio.
I'm also going to add, there was one person who worked for for the Regional Transit Authority. I'm not gonna say that person's name, but I remember he was quoted in a newspaper article saying something and this is back in 2014. I do remember it to this day, saying, because downtown Cleveland, for example, has experienced a growth in population of people, because people wanting to live in the city, in the central city. And then, there's the talk of additional public transit service. And the person from that Regional Transit Authority once said, it's amazing how people downtown want to pay $8 for a martini, but not $2 for a gallon of gas. I mean, you run you work for a public transit agency, but you're going to tell people to go out and get a car. I mean, doesn't that defeat the purpose?
Yes, it does. Okay, so I'm going to move on, unless Katie, you had something to add to that question? Okay, so our last question here, and then we're going to open it up for questions here from the audience. If you had one thing to add to improve it, sorry, we kind of viewed this as our miracle question, right? If money, time, resources were of no barrier, if you could add one thing to change and improve accessibility, what would it be? I think I will start with Katie, if you don't mind.
Thanks for calling it the miracle question. That's my social work heart is beaming. Thank you for doing that. Okay, so aside from being able to put sidewalks and curb cuts and crosswalks with timers everywhere, I would say, from what I've learned in focus groups and surveys and listening sessions, there's really a lot of power in knowing where things exist and what condition they're in. And so if we cannot get accessible sidewalks and infrastructure everywhere, from what I hear, the next best thing is to know exactly where those accessible features are, so that when individuals are planning trips, they know where they can get to safely.
All right, terrific. Vera.
Ooh, I was listening to Katie and I was still just like seeing little stars. On top of what Katie said, am I cheating by having two answers? Excuse me. In addition to what Katie said, I would connect all of Ohio somehow. And dare I say, like, make sure that every municipality in Ohio is covered by some form of transit system. Now, of course, in my fantasy, they work flawlessly and nobody is ableist, so I'm just going to give that as my answer for now.
If only, right? Edward?
Oh, sorry. What comes to mind is when you build bike lanes, protect them with bollards and pylons, but of course make room for cars that need to pull out. Just make it to where a car cannot drive in a bike lane, and also more frequent and more accessible public transit that connects to just figure out where the major employment nodes are and link and plan your public transit accordingly.
That's awesome. So for me, I would say from family members to family friends to friends of my own to people I've dated who are all able-bodied, the way they see their world changes when they go anywhere with me for any amount of time. So whenever somebody goes out to dinner with me, they suddenly realize that parking isn't accessible. Whenever somebody rides the bus with me, they suddenly realize all of the barriers that I have to encounter in my own life. So if time and resources were of no problem, I would want every person in the state of Ohio, or at least in Cincinnati, to have to follow me around, and all the planners at least, to have to follow me around and see the world through my eyes, have to follow a person with autism around, have to follow a person who is deaf around, so they can see the world through their eyes firsthand. Katie, you had your hand raised.
I just love all of these answers, but specifically, Neil, I wanted to say if people aren't already doing walk audits in their communities, that is a really great way to make sure that you are experiencing the good, the bad, and the ugly in the built environment, is doing walk audits. And there's a lot of resources out there, and I know a lot of people are doing them, but just in case, that's a really great way to get that firsthand experience.
Awesome. I hadn't heard that term before. That's interesting. All right. So I think we are going to open it up to individuals for the last 20 minutes or so. If you guys have any questions for the panel, I'll just keep my eye on the chat here.
I just want to point out that there is a question in the Q&A.
Is that Rick? Are there any cities in Ohio looking at creating school streets?
No, I'm sorry, not in the chat. At the bottom, you should see
Here, I got it. It's
There
from
it is.
Joe Duffy, and it
Thank
says,
you.
in terms of signage, wayfinding, transit schedules, etc., what are some general design aspects that might have the most inclusive, broad impact among marginalized groups? Thinking back to an article about challenges among folks with Alzheimer's disease, who can become easily disoriented in the public realm?
Katie?
I did not mean to have my hand up,
Oh,
but I could take a stab at it if you'd like,
sure.
unless someone else wants to. I guess I would say who can become disoriented in the public realm would be anybody if it's not designed well, right? Or if you're going to a new place and you've never experienced something. If I go to a new city and I want to ride their bus, it's gonna take some time for me to be able to think through that. I know there are specific guidelines for signage and font size and probably the actual font and colors, but there's also a lot of information, I believe, out in the ProAg. There's some signage information as well as universal design concepts. So there is a lot of information out there about how to do that. And I guess I will just literally never tire of saying this. Make sure you listen to local residents, or if you're working on signage in a certain neighborhood, gather residents from around that neighborhood to seek input and to make sure to the best of your ability that you are creating something accessible to everybody.
Okay, Vera?
Thank you. I just want to add that The ADA does have a certain set of requirements to make signage ADA accessible, and our transit systems and cities are required to follow those guidelines because they are federal agencies, and well, they receive funding from federal agencies. So those are pretty easy to look up. Honestly, just Googling ADA signage standards or sign standards. But I know that here in Toledo, we're looking at printing them out in contrasting colors, putting the route number on the sign, right? So if somebody walks up to it, they know they're getting on bus 22. Not just having to read it on the bus, but knowing that I'm on this fixed line that is fixed line 22, right? Or 31 or whatever that might be. And also including Braille, so someone can walk up to it and read it. So those are some best practices, but also like Katie said, the PROWAG, which is spelled PROWAG, is also a good standard to look at. And then I think the next question might be for Katie.
Is that Catherine Gervais?
Curious to hear how people are thinking about looking at complete streets through the lens of structural racism. So aside from making sure that we're using data to understand, where these areas of historic disinvestment are occurring, I don't know of any specific programs that are looking at that for complete streets, but I do know of some research, and I can find that article and put it in the chat, around these areas of disinvestment and where they occur, and then what I would imagine would be encouraging things like complete streets to make sure that they prioritize those areas first. So I don't have a ton to add to that, Catherine, but I will put that article in the chat box. Does anybody else have something better to add for that question?
I just want to thank Catherine for bringing up the conversation of structural racism in our transit systems. In Toledo, we unfortunately don't have the same initiative for complete streets. So I think Toledo is about 20 years behind in everything when it comes to the rest of Ohio. And I've been here 20 years, so I can say that I've earned the right. But thank you for bringing up the conversation. In Toledo, what we faced was that there was a thriving neighborhood over Collingwood area, for anybody that's familiar with this area, basically completely split to make room for a highway for 75. And of course, what you saw was that it split the neighborhood in half, basically. And so this thriving, Black neighborhood, Black businesses everywhere, faced poverty right away, basically, because it split everything up so badly, and it's still not really walkable. So this is a huge conversation when it comes to accessibility, because of course we know that people that are multiply marginalized, people forget, I think sometimes we think disability and the default might be white, but if you're a person of color, if you're a Black person who has a disability, that all of those layers add up against you when you're trying to access anything for yourself. So thank you for bringing up that conversation, and I hope that's something that we focus on more through the next conversations in the conference.
I wanted to answer the question about Ohio creating school streets. I do know that in the Cleveland area, there is this program called Safe Routes to School that I know that communities in Cleveland and around Cleveland have participated in to some degree, where you're creating like wayfinding initiatives, as well as trying to slow traffic down and enforcing speed limits around schools, and safer crosswalks, and safer routes for children who bike to school as well. And that's the one that comes to mind in terms of school streets in the Cleveland area.
Yeah, I know in the Cincinnati area, just about the same 12-month-ish period that I was getting hit by cars, there was a rash of kids in the Cincinnati schools that also were unfortunately also getting struck. That even more unfortunate resulted in a couple deaths, I believe. So that kind of, for obvious reasons, inspired Cincinnati to work toward Vision Zero. As far as specifically for schools, I don't know of anything, but as someone who doesn't live in the city directly and also isn't a parent, I can't really speak to that specific aspect of schools. Are there any more questions out there?
While we're waiting for additional questions, do you mind if I plug a couple of resources I just want to make sure people know about?
Plug away.
Okay. So a couple of things, if you're on this session and you're like, yes, I'm ready to dig in and I need to know more. A few resources nationally and locally that I want to make sure you know about. So nationally, the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center, NADTC, has a ton of great resources, and they do a really great job of starting at a foundational level of what terminology should you be using, what terminology should you not be using. They offer free photos of inclusive transportation that you can use to make sure that even if you're getting the language right and the font right, you want to make sure that your photos are inclusive on your brochures and information like that as well. Oh, thank you, Vera. I also want to mention that in Ohio, that ODOT is under their SHSP has a mature drivers committee. So statewide folks totally dedicated to making sure that we are supporting older adults that want to and are able to continue driving safely, and also promoting additional alternative modes of transportation resources, opportunities, data research. So they've got a website dedicated to that as well. Your age-friendly communities across Ohio, and then also making sure that you're looking at your coordinated plan. So that outlines how the federal 5310 funds dedicated to supporting older adults and people with disabilities transportation in your region. So I believe across the state of Ohio, everybody's coordinated plans are up there. And surely I'm missing things. I talked about your area agency on aging and your paratransit. So kind of running through a host of things, but if you're ready and you're working on something and you want to be able to be inclusive, those are some great places to start. Thank you for letting me put that in there, Neil.
I also wanted to answer a question that I saw in the chat box about any planning initiatives for people who are for the neurodiverse, people with autism for the state of Ohio or elsewhere. Now, for the state of Ohio, I personally am not sure, but I do know that there may be some throughout the country that probably exist that I'm not aware of. But that is something that I question as well. Like if like I understand that when we usually plan for people with disabilities, we usually think of by and large people who are visibly disabled, while those who have a hidden disability like autism, are often treated like everyone else, when really there's actually again going back to planning to include the lesser population percentage.
All right, thanks for that, Edward. I'm looking, so I don't see any questions. I'm looking in the chat box. Katie, did you want to answer that? I see you may have responded in the chat, but.
Yes, I just grabbed some statistics and put those in the chat box. I think generally speaking, hopefully everybody knows that the 65 plus population is poised to double by 2050. And that's not just in Ohio, that's globally. So really something to think about. And to Vera's point earlier, some intersectionality around older adults and adults with disabilities and those growing numbers as well. So one other thing that I've sort of been rolling around in my brain is there is a report out from the Ohio Developmental Disability Council, where they did a survey for individuals with disabilities and learning a lot about their transportation. And I think there's so much to be learned in general, but specifically around transportation from people with disabilities, because they aren't, for the most part, driving single occupancy vehicles to and from where they want to go, right? And so as we think as a state, how do we encourage people to think outside single occupancy vehicles? We have a huge amount to learn from people that maybe haven't been driving themselves, are high percentages riding the bus, using wheelchairs that are electric, right? So sort of rethinking about who are we really designing and planning for, who's really thinking outside the car already, and how can we learn from them as well.
Terrific. So I'm gonna just leave it to the panel here. If you guys have any final thoughts, if you have any other final resources or anything like that that you want to plug, just go right ahead, and then I think we're gonna let Angie say a couple final words afterward.
Okay, if not, I really want to thank our panelists. This is a great panel. I know I learned a lot, and I know we have a long way to go on this in Ohio. So I'm hoping people are really taking these words to heart, and we can continue these conversations. So right now, as far as the conference goes, we're going to take a little break. And when we come back at 11:30, we're going to be hearing from a really great speaker, Randall Keith Benjamin, who is a top person at the United States Department of Transportation right now, helping set policy to make our streets safer, to make our communities more equitable. And he's gonna be speaking specifically to how we can take advantage of the infrastructure bill, which was something that didn't come up very much in this conversation. But when we get all these ideas of cool things to pursue, how to make life better for different people who haven't been well served in the past, hopefully his conversation could come through with, here are the resources if you don't have a lot of resources in your community to get it done. So that hopefully that'll help put the pieces together. We're really excited to have Joyce Pan Wang from the city of Cleveland, Cleveland's planning director, new under Justin Bibb, who'll be moderating that and helping sort of bring in some local context. So we're going to take a break now, go grab a coffee, go grab lunch, whatever, answer emails, and we'll see you back here at 11:30. Thanks again, Vera, Katie, Neil, and you guys were
Nice to meet you
amazing.
all.
Thanks, guys.
It's great to speak among you. Take care.